The stagecoach left at dawn, and she was still standing there at noon, alone, in the middle of the New Mexico desert, with one trunk, one letter, and no one coming to claim her. The sun pressed down on her like a hand trying to push her into the earth. Dust swirled around her boots. The town behind her, if you could even call it a town, was barely 3 buildings and a water trough. No shade, no shelter, no mercy. Her name was Clara Weston, 24 years old. She had traveled 11 days by train and 2 more by stagecoach to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Douglas Hale, who had written her 6 letters over the course of 4 months. Letters that were warm, careful, honest, she thought. But Douglas Hale had not come, and nobody in that dust-choked little town seemed to know why. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that someone was watching her, from the ridge above the canyon, through the scope of a rifle he hadn't fired in 3 years. He had known she was coming before she ever stepped off that stagecoach, and he had been waiting, not for a week, not for a month, but for years. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, sending love your way. Because this story, this one, is going to stay with you. Clara Weston had not been a desperate woman. That was the first thing anyone who knew her would tell you. She was not the kind of woman who acted out of fear, or loneliness, or the pressure of small-town gossip. She was practical, grounded, the kind of woman who kept her hands busy and her thoughts quiet. She had grown up in Caldwell, Kansas, a mid-sized cattle town that smelled of livestock and railway grease and ambition. Her father had been a blacksmith. Her mother had died of fever when Clara was 9. She had raised her 2 younger brothers, kept the house, helped her father with the books, and somewhere in between all of that, she had simply forgotten to build a life of her own. By the time she was 23, the forgetting started to catch up with her. Her father remarried, a kind enough woman from Topeka, and suddenly the house that Clara had managed for 15 years became someone else's kitchen, someone else's hearth. The younger brothers were grown. One had gone north. One had gone to war and hadn't written in 8 months. Clara was not devastated. She was simply displaced. She had read the advertisement in the Kansas Weekly Gazette on a Tuesday morning in October, while sitting at the post office counter waiting for a letter that never came. Widowed rancher in New Mexico territory seeks a companion of good character and steady temperament. I am not a man of many words, but I am honest, and I will not waste your time. Write to Douglas Hale, Sanrio County, New Mexico. She almost turned the page, but she didn't. She wrote him that same evening. A short, careful letter. She told him who she was, what she was good at, and what she was not. She told him she wasn't looking for romance like in a dime novel. She was looking for something real. He wrote back in 12 days. His handwriting was slow and deliberate, like a man who chose each word the way a carpenter chooses which nail to use. He told her about his ranch, 400 acres in the Sanrio Valley, red canyon walls, a river that ran cold even in July. He told her he raised cattle and a few horses. He told her the nearest town was a place called Morrow Creek, 3 miles east of his property. He told her he had been alone for a long time. He did not say why. Over the next 3 months, they exchanged 6 letters. She learned that he had a dog named Compass, that he made his own bread because the baker in Morrow Creek oversalted everything, that he had a scar on his left hand from a fence accident when he was 19. She did not learn what had made him so careful with his words. She did not learn what he was afraid of. In February, he sent her a train ticket and a stagecoach schedule. He said he would be waiting for her at the Morrow Creek Depot on March the 14th. She packed 1 trunk. She said goodbye to her father and her stepmother. She sat in a train car for 11 days, watching Kansas become Oklahoma, watching Oklahoma become Texas, watching Texas slowly bleed into the pale, enormous silence of New Mexico. She arrived at the Morrow Creek Depot on the morning of March 14th. The platform was empty. She waited 1 hour. 2. By noon, she had asked every person she could find. The station master, the woman who ran the small dry goods store across the dirt road, 2 cowboys tying their horses at the post, if anyone knew Douglas Hale. 2 of them looked away too fast. One of them, the station master, an older man with a white beard and oil-stained fingers, looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. Not pity. Something older than pity. Something that looked almost like guilt. He told her he hadn't seen Douglas Hale in 6 weeks. And then the stagecoach that had brought her there pulled out of Morrow Creek heading back east. And Clara stood in the desert sun with her one trunk and her one letter and nothing else. She looked out at the canyon walls in the distance. Red and silent and enormous. And she made a decision that most women would not have made. She didn't cry. She didn't board the next train home. She picked up her trunk. And she started walking toward the canyon. She didn't know yet that the rifle on the ridge above had already found her. And she didn't know yet that the man holding it was not a stranger. His name was not Douglas Hale. His name was Eli Cutter, and he had not left that ridge in 4 days. He was 38 years old, lean and weathered in the way that New Mexico made men lean and weathered, like wood left too long in the sun, all the softness baked out, only the grain remaining. He had dark eyes that didn't move quickly, the kind of eyes that saw everything but reacted to nothing. A beard that had gone past deliberate and into forgotten. Boots that had been resoled twice. He had been watching the town of Morrow Creek through the scope of a Winchester rifle. Not because he intended to shoot anyone. He hadn't intended to shoot anyone in 3 years. He watched because watching was the only thing he trusted anymore. And because he needed to know if she arrived safely. He had known about Clara Weston for 4 months. He had known the moment Douglas Hale put that advertisement in the Kansas Gazette, because Eli Cutter made it his business to know everything Douglas Hale did. He had been doing so for 7 years. He watched through his scope as the stagecoach rolled into Morrow Creek at 9:30 in the morning. He watched the small figure step down from the coach. Dark coat, brown hair pulled tight, one trunk, and he felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for. She was real. He had known she would be real, obviously. People were always real. But somehow, knowing she had come all this way, 11 days on a train, 2 more on a stagecoach, to marry a man who would never come for her made her feel real in a way that was almost unbearable. He watched her wait on the platform. He watched her walk to the dry goods store, then back. He watched her speak to old Walt Briggs, the station master, and he saw the exact moment Walt's face did what it always did. That complicated expression that sat somewhere between cowardice and conscience. He watched the stagecoach leave without her. And then he watched her do something that surprised him. She picked up that trunk. And she started walking west. Toward the canyon. Toward the Hale property. 3 miles through open desert with no road, no shade, no water that he could see. Eli lowered the rifle slowly. He stayed on the ridge for another 10 minutes. Watching her figure grow smaller in the desert. Then he packed up his bedroll, led his horse down the back of the ridge by hand so the hooves wouldn't echo, and took the long canyon route that would bring him out ahead of her. He had a decision to make before she got there. The problem with decisions, in Eli Cutter's experience, was that most of the ones that mattered had already been made for him, made years ago by other people in other rooms, with no concern for who would be left to live with the consequences. 7 years ago, a man named Douglas Hale had done something, and Eli had spent every year since then making sure it never happened again. He tied his horse to a juniper tree at the base of the canyon trail and sat down on a flat red rock with his hat in his hands. He thought about the 6 letters she had written. He hadn't read them, he wasn't that kind of man, but he had intercepted 2 of Hale's responses before they were sent, back in November, just to make sure Hale wasn't telling her something that would put her in danger. The letters had surprised him. They were decent letters, quiet, honest in their way. Whoever Douglas Hale was pretending to be in those pages, that version of him was almost believable. But Eli knew the other version. He heard her before he saw her. The sound of a trunk being dragged across gravel and caliche clay. Then a pause. Then the dragging again. She was not stopping. He had to give her that. He stood up, stepped out from behind the rock. She saw him and stopped. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She put herself between him and the trunk and looked at him with brown eyes that were steady and exhausted and furious all at once. "Are you Douglas Hale?" she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, like a woman who had already decided she was done being surprised. Eli looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "Do you know where he is?" The pause that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. She stared at him. The desert hummed around them, whined through the canyon walls, a hawk somewhere unseen, the tick of heat on stone. "Then I suggest," she said carefully, "that you start talking." He didn't take her to the Hale Ranch. He took her to his own place, a modest adobe house set back against the canyon wall, shaded in the afternoon by a rock overhang, surrounded by nothing but scrub and silence and the distant sound of his cattle grazing in the lower pasture. It wasn't a welcoming house. It was a functional house, clean but not decorated. A wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, and a rifle rack above the door with 3 guns she noticed immediately. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any. She sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen with the particular economy of a man who had been alone long enough that he had stopped performing normalcy for anyone. She did not feel afraid of him. She wasn't sure if that was wisdom or stupidity. "My name is Eli Cutter," he said, setting the coffee in front of her. "I have a ranch about a mile north of the Hale property. I've been here 11 years. "And Douglas Hale?" she said. He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his own cup. "Douglas Hale is alive," he said. "He's in Albuquerque. Has been for about 6 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. "Did he leave because of me?" "No." Eli looked at her directly. "He left because of himself." It was not the answer she expected. He told her what he could. He told her that Douglas Hale had left the ranch in February, before her last letter had even arrived, before she had confirmed her travel dates. He told her that Hale had debts, not small ones, the kind of debts a man builds when he spends 3 years making poor decisions and blaming bad luck for all of them. He told her that the ranch, the 400 acres, the Red Canyon walls, the river that ran cold in July, was mortgaged twice over. That the bank in Santa Fe had sent a man out to survey the property the week before Hale disappeared. He told her the advertisement in the Kansas Gazette had not been an act of loneliness. It had been an act of calculation. She absorbed this slowly, the way you absorb something that confirms a fear you didn't know you had. "He wanted a wife to make the ranch look stable," she said. It wasn't a question. Eli nodded once. "A wife, maybe some story about turning things around. Buy himself time with the bank. And the letters." She set her cup down very carefully. "The careful, honest letters. I can't speak to the letters. I didn't read them. They were good letters," she said quietly. "Not with admiration. With something colder. That's the worst part. They were genuinely good letters." Eli said nothing. He had found, over the years, that silence was more respectful than false comfort. Outside, the afternoon light was changing. The canyon walls were going from red to deep orange to something that almost looked purple. A wind came through and rattled the single window above the wood stove. "Is there something you're not telling me?" she said. He looked at her across the table. And there it was, that thing she couldn't name. That thing old Walt at the station had shown her, only cleaner in Eli's face. More deliberate, like he had decided exactly how much of it to let show. "There's a great deal I'm not telling you," he said. She held his gaze. "Then I'd like you to start." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said a name he had not said aloud in 7 years. A name that lived in him the way a bullet lives in a man when the surgeon can't get it out. Not killing him, just making every movement slightly wrong. Her expression changed when he said it. Not with recognition, with something stranger. With the particular stillness of someone who has just heard the name of a person they have been trying not to think about. "How do you know that name?" she said. And Eli Cutter looked at her and understood, for the first time in 7 years, that this was not a coincidence. None of it had been a coincidence. Her mother's name had been Ruth Calloway. Before she was Ruth Weston, before Caldwell, Kansas, before the blacksmith's house, before the fever that took her when Clara was 9. She had been Ruth Calloway of Socorro County, New Mexico. Born there, raised there, and for a brief, brutal period of her life, kept there against her will by a man who believed he owned her. Clara had known fragments of this. Her father had told her only what he thought she could bear, which was not very much. A bad man. A situation her mother escaped from before Clara was born. A past that had no business following them into the present. But Clara had always felt the shape of the thing she hadn't been told. The way you can feel a door in a dark room, you can't see it, but the air changes near it. The name Eli had said was the name behind the door. His full name was James Calloway, Ruth's older brother. Clara's uncle by blood. A man who had controlled her mother's life in Socorro County, with the combination of charm and violence that certain men have mastered since the beginning of the world. A man who had driven Ruth Calloway out of New Mexico and into Kansas with nothing but a carpet bag and the kind of terror that becomes permanent. Clara had never met him. She had thought of him, when she thought of him at all, as a chapter that was finished. James Calloway died 4 years ago, she said. He did, Eli said. Then why? Because Douglas Hale is his son. The wood stove ticked. The wind moved outside. Somewhere far down the canyon, a coyote started and stopped. Clara sat very still. Say that again, she said. Douglas Hale is James Calloway's son by his first wife. He took his mother's name after Calloway died, or so the story goes. He came to Sanrio County 3 years ago. Bought the land that used to belong to your grandfather. She felt the floor shift beneath her. Not literally. But the kind of shifting that happens when the architecture of what you thought was true turns out to have been built on sand. He targeted me, she said. I believe so. He knew who I was when he placed the advertisement. I believe so. And you. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to yet. How do you know all of this? Who are you in this story? Eli Cutter. He got up from the table, walked to the window, stood with his back to her for a moment. Not from evasiveness, she sensed. From the particular difficulty of saying something true. I was a Pinkerton man, he said. For 11 years. Before I came here. She waited. 7 years ago, I was assigned to a case in Socorro County. A woman had filed a complaint. Took her 4 tries to find someone who would write it down. She said her brother had stolen land from her family. Legal theft, the way powerful men do it. Paperwork and pressure and the slow wearing down of a person until they sign whatever's put in front of them. He turned around. The woman was your mother, he said. And I failed her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 7 years of something that lived in the lines of his face and the careful way he chose every word. She died before I could finish the case, he said. Before I could get any of it back for her. The complaint was buried. The land stayed with Calloway. And I left the Pinkertons. And came here, Clara said. And came here. She looked at him across the room. This man she had known for 3 hours, who carried her mother's name in him like that bullet that won't come out. Why? She said. He looked back at her steadily. Because I promised her I would, he said. She made me promise, right at the end. Said someone should watch over the land. Said it didn't belong to Calloway and it never would. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. Outside, the desert darkened. The stars began. And somewhere in Albuquerque, a man named Douglas Hale, who was born James Calloway Jr., was sitting in a saloon, probably drinking, probably not thinking about the woman he had left on a platform in the desert. He should have been thinking about her. He should have been thinking about what was coming. She slept in Eli's house that night. His bed, him on the floor by the stove without discussion or complaint. And in the morning when he woke just before dawn she was already up, sitting at the table with her trunk open and a document in her hands he had never seen before. What's that? He said. The deed to my grandfather's land, she said. The original one. My mother kept it. My father gave it to me when I left Kansas. He didn't know what it was. He just said my mother had always wanted me to have it. Eli sat down slowly. She placed it on the table between them. Old paper, carefully folded. The ink faded but legible. The Calloway family land grant in Socorro County. Signed, dated, witnessed. She kept it, he said quietly. She kept it, Clara said. What they both understood, without needing to say it all the way out loud, was that this document changed everything. A legal land deed, original, signed, recorded, superseded everything James Calloway had done with his paperwork and his pressure. If the land transfer to Calloway had been fraudulent, and Eli had spent 7 years building a paper case that said it was, then this deed was the cornerstone. The one piece that made the whole structure stand. But there was a problem. The land was currently occupied by Douglas Hale, who had inherited it from his father's estate. And Douglas Hale, whatever else he was not going to walk away from 400 acres of New Mexico Canyon land because a woman showed up with an old document. Not without legal process. Not without a lawyer. Not without, and this was the part that Eli explained carefully over coffee and bread, the right judge. Because the judge in Sanrio County was a man named Herbert Cross, who had been on the Calloway family payroll since before Clara was born, who had signed off on the original fraudulent transfer, who would find procedural reasons to bury any claim Clara filed until she ran out of money or patience, whichever came first. The right judge was in Santa Fe, a federal man, a man Eli had been building toward for 3 years. 3 years, Clara said. These things take time. You've been building this case for 3 years and you're still not ready. I was almost ready, he said. And then Hale placed that advertisement and I realized he knew you existed, which meant I needed to move faster. He looked at her evenly. Which means we need to go to Morrow Creek today. There's a telegraph office. I need to send a wire to Santa Fe. She looked at him. And what am I supposed to do while you send your wire? She said. Stay in the telegraph office. Absolutely not. He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. Something that acknowledged, without making a show of it, that he was not going to win this particular argument. They rode into Morrow Creek at 9:30 in the morning. Eli on his gray horse, Clara on the spare mare who turned out to be considerably more spirited than her age suggested. Clara rode well. He noted this and didn't comment on it. The town watched them arrive. Morrow Creek was small enough that 2 riders coming in together was an event worth pausing for. The man at the barber shop stepped to his doorway. The woman hanging wash behind the dry goods store stopped with her arms full of linen and stared. Old Walt Briggs was standing outside the telegraph office as if he had been expecting them. He looked at Clara, then at Eli, then at the ground. Walt, Eli said. Eli, Walt said. Clara looked between them. You know each other. Walt is one of the few people in this town who knows what Hale is, Eli said. And what he's done. Walt was here when Calloway owned this county. Weren't you, Walt? The old man's face did something complicated. I was young, he said. You were a witness to the original land transfer, Eli said. You signed your name to it. Walt looked at Clara. His eyes were old and tired and carrying something heavy. Your mother was a fine woman, he said. I'm sorry. I've been sorry for 30 years. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Sorry doesn't give anything back, she said. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. But testimony might, Eli said. Are you willing to testify to what you saw? In Santa Fe, in front of a federal judge. Walt was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The street was quiet around them. Somewhere inside the saloon across the road, a piano had stopped playing. Walt looked up. Yes, he said. God help me, yes. Eli turned toward the telegraph office door. That was when they heard the horse. One horse, coming fast from the eastern road. And as it came into view, Clara felt the blood in her face go somewhere else entirely, because the rider pulling up in front of them, dust-covered and red-eyed and smelling of 3 days of hard travel, was Douglas Hale. And in his hand was a piece of paper. And his eyes, when they found Clara, were not apologetic. They were calculating. Douglas Hale was a handsome man. That was the first thing you noticed, and probably what had kept people trusting him past the point where trust was warranted. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the easy confidence of a man who had rarely been told no. His features were clean. His voice, when he spoke, was the kind of voice that made you want to believe whatever it was saying. He looked at Clara like a man who has lost a card game and come back to renegotiate. "Miss Weston," he said, pulling his horse to a stop and climbing down. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me considerably more than that," she said. He glanced at Eli. His jaw shifted just slightly, the only thing that wasn't perfectly composed. "Cutter," he said. "I should have known." "You did know," Eli said. "That's why you ran when you heard I was in Albuquerque asking questions." Hale held up the paper in his hand. "I went to Santa Fe," he said. "Not Albuquerque. To file this." He held it toward Clara. "I had my lawyer draw it up. It's a transfer of the ranch deed. To you." Nobody moved. "Why?" Clara said. It was not a grateful question. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "I thought if I brought you here, established a household, a marriage, a legitimate operation, the bank would give me more time. I thought I could fix things." He dropped his hand. "I was wrong. And when I understood that I was wrong, I ran. Like my father would have. And then I realized—" He stopped. His voice, for just a moment, lost its smoothness. "I realized I did not want to be my father." Silence. The word father hung in the air of Morrow Creek like smoke. Eli watched Hale's face carefully. He had been reading faces for 15 years, first as a Pinkerton, then as a man alone in the desert with too much time and too much history. He looked for the lie. He looked for the calculation beneath the confession. He found something more complicated than either. "The deed transfer doesn't resolve the title question," Eli said. "The land isn't legitimately his to transfer." "I know that," Hale said. "My lawyer explained it. That's why I also signed an affidavit." He reached into his coat and produced a second document. "Attesting to the original transfer from my father's estate. Confirming it was built on a fraudulent foundation. It won't be enough on its own, but I was told it would help." Clara looked at him for a long time. She was thinking Eli could tell about the 6 letters. About the man in those pages who made his own bread and had a dog named Compass and wrote slowly and carefully because he chose each word like a nail. "Is any of it real?" she said quietly. "The ranch, the bread, the dog." Hale looked at her and something moved behind his eyes. "Compass is real," he said. "He's been at the property alone for 6 weeks. I didn't know what to do about the dog." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "The ranch is real," he said. "400 acres. Red Canyon walls. River that runs cold in July." He paused. "I did not write false descriptions, Miss Weston. I wrote true ones. It was only my intentions that were dishonest." "That's a significant distinction," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." The street of Morrow Creek held itself in a strange, suspended stillness. The barber was still in his doorway. Walt Briggs stood with his hands in his pockets. The piano in the saloon stayed quiet. Eli thought about 7 years. He thought about a woman named Ruth Calloway, sitting in a Pinkerton field office in Socorro County with her hands folded in her lap and her voice steady despite everything, asking if anyone was going to help her. He thought about the promise he had made. He thought about the way promises sometimes work. Not the way you intend them to, not in a straight line from then to now, but in crooked, roundabout ways that take you through places you never anticipated. He had come to the Sanrio Valley to watch over land. He had not anticipated the woman who would come to claim it. He had not anticipated that she would be Ruth Calloway's daughter, or that she would pick up a trunk and walk 3 miles into the desert rather than go home. He had not anticipated that she would sit across a table from him at midnight with her mother's land deed in her hands, or that she would ride into town the next morning like she had been riding this particular road her whole life. He had not anticipated any of it. But he understood, standing in the street of Morrow Creek with the morning sun cutting long shadows across the dust, that the 7 years had been pointed here. That all of it, the waiting, the watching, the slow accumulation of evidence and regret, had been aimed at this moment. He took the affidavit from Douglas Hale's hand. "Read it carefully," folded it, put it in his coat. "Walt," he said, "get your good coat." We're going to Santa Fe. Walt nodded, went inside. Eli turned to Clara. She was looking at Hale, and Hale was looking at the ground, and neither of them was speaking. What passed between them in that silence was not forgiveness. It was something more preliminary than that, the acknowledgement that a wrong had been done, that it could perhaps be addressed, and that nothing between them was finished or resolved. It was an honest silence, maybe the most honest thing Hale had offered her. "Come," Eli said to her, not as a command, as an invitation. She turned from Hale and looked at Eli Cutter, this lean, weathered, careful man who had kept a promise to her dead mother for 7 years in a desert canyon and never told anyone. "Is this actually going to work?" she said. He thought about it honestly. He did not believe in false comfort, and she did not want it. "I don't know," he said, "but we have the deed. We have the affidavit. We have Walt. And we have each other." She looked at him for a moment. "We have each other?" she repeated slowly, as if she was testing the weight of the phrase. "If you're willing," he said carefully. The sun was fully up now. The canyon walls above Morrow Creek were turning from orange to gold. Compass the dog was alone on a ranch 3 miles west, waiting for someone to come back. Clara Weston picked up her coat from her saddlebag and put it on. "Let's go," she said. The federal judge in Santa Fe was a man named Aldous Crane. He had iron-gray hair and reading spectacles he removed frequently and replaced with the air of a man performing patience. He heard the case over 2 days, the affidavit, the original deed, Walt Briggs' trembling but clear testimony about the day 30 years ago when he had signed his name to something he knew was wrong. He ruled on the 3rd day. The land in Sanrio County, originally belonging to the Calloway family by legal grant, had been transferred through fraudulent coercion. The transfer was void. The land reverted to the surviving heir of the original grantee, Clara Weston. She stood in that courthouse and received the news with the same steadiness she had brought to every other thing this month. The abandoned platform, the desert, the truth about Douglas Hale, the name behind the door. The steadiness was not coldness. It was the particular strength of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the long 11 days on a train watching Kansas become New Mexico, that whatever she found at the end of this journey, she would face it standing. Douglas Hale did not contest the ruling. He left New Mexico within the month. Where he went, nobody seemed to know, and nobody seemed troubled by not knowing. Compass the dog was there when Clara arrived at the ranch for the first time. He came off the porch at a run and pressed himself against her legs with the desperate relief of an animal that has been waiting too long. She knelt down and held him in the dust of the yard for a long time. Eli Cutter went back to his adobe house against the canyon wall. He did not go immediately, and he did not go far. What happened between him and Clara in the months that followed was its own story. Quiet, cautious, built from small things. Coffee in the morning. Help with fencing. A book left on a table. A name said without difficulty. Then said again. The slow, careful architecture of 2 people who had both lived too long inside their own silences and were relearning, one word at a time, what it meant to let someone in. Ruth Calloway's daughter came to New Mexico to marry a stranger. And she found, instead, the man who had kept his promise to her mother for 7 years in a desert canyon and never asked for anything in return. The land was hers. The red canyon walls. The river that ran cold in July. And somewhere in the history of that earth, in the red rock and the cold water and the bones of everything that had happened there, her mother was finally at rest. What would you have done? If you arrived to find everything you trusted had been a lie, would you have walked back to the train? Or would you have picked up your trunk and walked toward the canyon? Sometimes the desert takes everything from you, and sometimes it gives you back something you didn't even know you'd lost. If the story moved you, drop a comment below. And if you're new here, welcome. There are more stories where this came from. Stay a while.